Christine, come here, quickly, run to me, leap into my arms. Would you introduce me to your friends?
Indeed. Eddie Quintella on keyboards.
Thank you, sir.
Stephen Bruton on guitar.
Thank you, Stephen.
Stephen Ferroni on drums.
Stand up, Stephen, for goodness sake.
George Hawkins on bass.
Thank you, George.
And Todd Sharp, of course, who I wrote many of the songs with on this record.
Todd, I want to talk about you. Bring the keyboard in. I'll talk about him while we cover him up with the keyboard. Come over here, Todd, just a second while they're going to run this machinery in and we'll never see you. Why did you select this man to be your co-writer?
Well, I've known Todd for about 9 years altogether now, but we just started writing, I suppose, about 3 years ago.
Is she difficult?
No, not at all. Lots of fun.
No, seriously. You can tell me the truth now. Is she tough?
No.
Shh, quiet.
No, she's lots of fun. We had a real good time.
You lie. Get out.
We're back.
Yes, we're back, Todd.
All right.
So, you back to a little bit with playing with Christine McVie. Now, I found an old clip, and there was another guitar player on the tour, and it looked like Stephen Bruton was playing.
Yes, Stephen. There's actually were two at one point. There was Billy Burnett for a minute, and then Billy had other commitments he needed to do. So we made the record with one guitar player, me, and then we toured, and we figured we need another guitar player in the band. So we called Stephen Bruton, who was, Stephen's been my best friend pretty much ever since I first met him. We used to be in a band together. Matter of fact, George Hawkins, everything sort of ties together, right?
It does.
So, I met George when I played with Daryl and John. He was playing with Kenny Loggins. We became friends. George and Tristan Bowden, drummer, played with Kenny Loggins. Then we were working together with Mick Fleetwood in Africa. I don't know, 10 years later or something, or 5 years later. And so at some point, I guess George called me and said, we're putting a band together with Tom Canning from Al Jarreau's band. And you need to be in it. And this guy, Stephen Bruton, is also going to be in it. And Tris is going to play drums. And we're called the Lucky Dogs. And the only reason we have this band, we're not trying to get a record deal or any of that stuff. We're just going to play every Thursday at the Trancas Bar in Malibu. That's our aspirations here.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we did. We had a band called the Lucky Dogs in the early 80s or something. Yeah, early 80s. Stephen and I played guitar, Tom Canning on keyboards, good, brilliant musician. George played bass. Tristan Bowden played drums from Loggins' band, now in Chicago, been with Chicago forever. Great drummer.
Oh. Was he playing with Chris Christopherson at that point? Who was he?
Stephen would have been working with Christopherson at that point, and maybe a little with Delbert McClinton.
Okay.
Here and there. And probably other people that I wouldn't know at that point.
Yeah.
But we met and just became instant best friends, couple of guitar players, and had that ability to kind of like each other, play together, work together, and not fight each other as players, which is kind of, with guitar players, can be interesting sometimes.
That takes a lot.
So, and then when Christine did her record, as a matter of fact, Christine was, that was the original plan, was, okay, I'm just going to get you, and Tris is going to play drums, and George is going to play bass, and we're good. We got a band. Turned out Tris had other commitments. Couldn't do Christine's record. He really wanted to, of course, but he couldn't do it, so we started looking for another drummer. Then when it came time to tour, we needed another guitar player, so I called Stephen and said, man, let's come out and do this. It'll be a blast. So Stephen played guitar in Christine's band when we toured. Lovely guy. He passed away, almost 5 years ago now, I guess. Was my best friend. And, I miss him every day. Brilliant player. Really great guy, too. Just a great guy to talk to. But a great musician, great songwriter, too. Really.
He did some great solo records and his work as a sideman with Delbert and Chris Christopherson and Bonnie Raitt and on and on. He was stellar work.
I taught him most of that stuff.
I can tell. So after Christine, did you go straight into working with Rod Stewart, or where did Rod Stewart come into the picture?
Quite a bit later. But so after Christine, I wrote that record with her. I started to get some good things were looking good for me,
Okay.
at that point. I had some other songs that were cut. I had a big Juice Newton cut. I was getting some interest and got a record deal. And I made a record for
Right,
MCA
for
Records
MCA. Yes.
in 85, 84 and 85, actually,
Okay.
which was released in 86. And, to continue to do session work, write songs, and try and establish a solo career, which didn't really come together. And just gigged around, I guess. Did a lot of interesting things. Don Gaiman was my producer on my solo record for MCA, who had worked with John Mellencamp. Did all the big Mellencamp stuff, Jack and Diane. And Don brought me, so I started to work with him on other projects. Eric Carmen was one. Jimmy Barnes, played with him for a little while. Jimmy is like Bruce Springsteen of Australia. Like if Australia is like Jimmy Barnes he's a god there. So I did a record with Jimmy, and then I did a tour with him in Australia, for like 3 or 4 months or something. It was a long time. And just, whatever I, knocked around and was playing with David Crosby, I think, at that time. And maybe a gig occasionally with Bonnie Raitt. Not even, no. I did a few sessions with Bonnie.
Okay.
And which I think ended up being I only sang on a few things. I played guitar on a song with this very guitar right here. And they didn't use that track on the record. But anyhow, got to know Bonnie and, loved her. Another person, I probably have her first album at home, and then kind of got to work with her a little bit. Wonderful lady. Great guitar player, as well as a great singer, but a really great guitar player. And so I guess one day I got a phone call from my old buddy Carmine Rojas. Carmine is a bass player. When I played with Hall & Oates, back when I was 19, Carmine, somehow he and I became friends. He was playing with LaBelle at the time.
Okay.
So we were we'd hang out once in a while in New York. Somehow I got to know him. At that time, Carmine had a fro, and people called him Pee-wee. That was his nickname. And Carmine went on to play with David Bowie and, a lot of people. Anyhow, out of the blue, Carmine calls me. He says, "Hey, you want to play with Rod?" I said, "I think so. I'm supposed to go on tour with David Crosby. I might. When's it start? What's the deal?" He said, "Well, you got to learn, like 40 songs. We start rehearsing next week, and it's like a year tour." So I said, "Okay, when do I audition? How's that work, And he said, "Well, you don't audition. You just, it's your gig if you want it. I'm the band leader." I said, "What if Rod don't like me?" He said, "Well, then he'll fire you."
Yeah.
That's kind of how this one works. Sharp, you want to do it or not?
Yeah.
So I said, "Okay." So that's when I started to work with Rod. I guess that was 88 or 89.
Okay.
And that was great. That was some fun years. I actually learned a lot playing with Rod.
Like what?
Well, so, for instance, we rehearsed for, probably 10 days. Me and Steve Ferris came into the band. Steve used to play in Mr. Mister, another
Yes.
great guitar player.
Yes.
Two of us came in as the guitar guys and rehearsed. Carmine kind of ran the rehearsals. Tony Brock played drums, great drummer from the Babies, English guy. Chuck Kentis on keyboards, and Rick Braun on trumpet, who now has a brilliant solo career. Nick Lane on trombone, Jimmy Roberts on sax. All great musicians. And we're just we're just running Rod songs. We're learning. And of course, I grew up listening to at least half of it, if not more. So you kind of already know some of them. and Rod's not even there. I mean, it just so probably the second rehearsal before we're ready to go to South America to open this tour, big, huge worldwide tour. Rod comes in, I meet him, and he's just listening as we're running his songs down, and he's not singing anything, not yet, anyhow. And he just kind of walked up to me and said, "I like the way you do the sweet little rock and roll. That's good, yeah." And he says, "Can you sing?" And I said, "Yeah, I sing."
Yeah.
And he said, "Could you learn the harmony to, and he gives me a couple of his songs. Like Some Guys Have All the Luck and something. There's some harmony with me." And I said, "Okay." So I go home and I learn them and I come to rehearsal the next day and he doesn't sing. He's just kind of listening to the band and kind of going, all right. And we got, and our first show's in Brazil, soccer stadium, 90,000 people. And we're in the dressing room getting ready to go on stage. And I said, "Do you want to go over those harmony parts?" And he says, "No, we'll just do it on stage." And that was kind of what working with Rod was like. But when you walked on stage with Rod Stewart, it was a party. I mean, it was a extravaganza and a show, and a real show. And so, Rod's music, his history in music, and he's a great singer. He's one of the greatest singers ever. And he's got this legacy. And in his, he's another guy that, obviously he's evolved into such different, like now he's, he does torch songs sometimes, and then he does some rock and roll. And I always dug the rock and roll stuff. But anyhow, playing with Rod was like as soon as the curtain went up, which sometime, at one point we did a round thing. It's a huge production, gosh, I don't know, 70 people out there on the road and staging and stuff like I'd never seen before. And the curtain would go up, man, and it would be always like, wow, oh, here we go, because the place would go nuts, full of girls and women mostly, and they'd throw their underwear at you, and it was just a party. It was awful. It was terrible. And occasionally Rod might say something, about a part, but usually, he was kind of like, "Well, you play, you got this. I don't, you certainly don't want to reinvent, well, you probably can't hear this. You're not going to change that.
Yeah.
You're not going to change the opening to Maggie May. You're not going to change the signature stuff that, connects to people's hearts as soon as they hear it. But Rod was just so cool about like, just play whatever you do. I'm good with it. I like the way you play.
Yeah.
You're fine.
So what was your rig when you were working with Rod Stewart, playing in, stadiums and arenas?
It was loud.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny. The first rehearsal I walked into, I had 2 Dumble amps at the time.
Okay.
I had custom-made Dumble heads, 150 watts each. I didn't want one. I got 2 because I had to have 2.
Yeah.
And so I think I brought him to rehearsal, and before I even plugged in, I mean, I walked by the drum monitor when Tony hit his snare drum, and it was so loud. I looked at the monitor guy. I was like, "You know about that?" He just laughed at me. He went like,
Yeah.
"This guy's new."
Yeah.
And we started to play, and it was the loudest band I ever played, and it was so loud. But, I had the amps to keep up with it. So I had 2 Dumbles. And really was the only time I ever had the opportunity to air those babies out, because they're great big heads, and they were loud, and they sound great,
So were these overdrive specials or steel string singers, or what were they? They
They
were
were
just something
kind of-
custom made for you?
I was playing with Mick Fleetwood in a rehearsal. Dumble used to have an office, a closet, in a place in LA called the Alley. I mean, literally it was a closet, and that's where he built his amps.
Okay.
So one of his amps was in the rehearsal room, and I was plugged into it, and I played it, and I just freaked out. This would have been, I don't know, 79 or 80 or something. And, at that time, man, no one was doing gain channel thing properly. I mean, Mesa was doing it, but just was Mesa. It was good, but it was like you either wanted to sound like Carlos Santana or don't use Mesa. And I wasn't it. So I plugged in the Dumble. I freaked. I just said, okay, I got to have one of these. And, I don't know what that amp was. I think it was a David Lindley amp or something. It was a great, big, powerful head. I said, build me one like this. And so, some time passed. And I finally got one of them. And they're actually unique. As the only two he ever made like that. I think, as it turns out, they are probably the most valuable Dumbles out there, which is kind of like, but I sold them. Well, I sold one of them. I kept one because at some point I went, I do not need two of these amps.
Right.
So I'm going to sell one. And I sold one, not for much more than I paid for it, really. And, this is way before things got nuts. And naturally, the other one got stolen with all my stuff. Everything I owned got stolen once.
Yeah.
And so some years later, with the Dumble thing, we're kind of veering off into the Dumble corner.
Right.
This guy calls me from Germany who's making a coffee table book about Dumble amps. It's a great book. He actually has like every amp. It's by serial number and the story behind it and a picture. It's kind of interesting. So he calls me and he says, I know you wrote a thing for a magazine once about this. Got permission to reprint it. And he interviewed me and asked me about the amp. And he put a nice picture of me in there. And he sent me a copy of the book. And I opened the book and I read it. And at the end of my little story, and it's like Todd Sharp had these two amps. They're very rare. Serial numbers 120 and 121. And 121, here's a picture of it, recently sold on an auction online for, what was the number? $92,000. And I looked at that and I went, I just spent the rest of the day, going, $92,000.
92,000.
92? Wow. I mean, it was a good amp, but it, wasn't that good. Anyways, that's my Dumble stuff. I played Dumbles with Rod. I also played Marshalls.
Okay.
After a while.
And Strats or
Oh
Tylers?
gosh, with Rod, lots of guitars. Matter of fact, that's a kind of a pivotal moment for me. So this is the 80s, man, and I'm right there with all the LA guys. I've got a Bradshaw rack that's beautiful. I got a little mini refrigerator with switching stuff, MIDI controllable, program change. I got a Marshall. I got an AC30. I got a API equalizer. I got a Uri limiter in there. I got some, chorus, and I got a Echoplex in a drawer. Eventually an Eventide harmonizer for echoes. And I got a Silvertone that I use for slide. I got, I had this out there. I had a white Strat. I had a Telecaster, all kind of stuff. I also kind of played all the acoustic guitar stuff. So I got 12 strings and nylon string. And, but, sometimes you find yourself in that thing when you walk into a gig like that as guitar guy, you got to learn all this stuff from, Stay With Me to Maggie May to the 80s stuff. Which was probably Michael Landau and a lot more, and cover a lot of things. So you tend to go to all those tools to do it. And that's kind of your thing. So that's kind of what I did when I played with Rod. And there were always, guitar changes all the time. It was a big deal because I would constantly be going from, the 12 string to the Telecaster for a little bit of sweet little rock and roller. And, then we're going to do one of his 80s songs. So I had a Jim Tyler guitar.
Okay.
That was actually the main guitar by Tyler. At some point while playing with Rod, I picked up this guitar, this very one, Stratocaster. I bought it in England. I think it was Coventry, England. I walked into a music store. I'd been on the road with Rod for a long time, so I had a little money in my pocket. And I asked the guy if he, I was kind of looking for a Strat. And I asked the guy if he had anything. He said, well, I keep the good stuff upstairs. and he had some stuff up there. He had one of Hendrix's Strats, and this was the one that, it's a 59. I think I paid $4,500 for it or something like that, which at the time was a decent deal, I guess.
Yeah.
And then, but once I got that guitar, and then later on, I picked up a Ampeg VT40 in Sweden, of all places. Because when you're in Sweden, that's where you want to buy gear,
Yes.
so you can figure out how to get it home.
Yes.
It's much more fun that way.
And pay a lot more for it.
And pay more for it, yes. And but you know what I also have learned is that, like, when you plug into something and you go, ooh, that's it, buy it. You know what I mean? That's the one you want. So anyhow, I bought a VT40 and I got that Strat. And somewhere in that period, I kind of found something for me. And then I moved to Nashville and I stopped playing with Rod. I was kind of, well, I fired him. Okay.
Yeah, which you had to do.
He started to get, big-headed about things.
And also the underwear was starting to irritate you on stage.
That and, singers.
Yeah,
I mean,
singers.
they're singers.
Yeah.
So I kicked him out of the band and moved to Nashville.
Okay.
I started working with Delbert McClinton.
Yeah.
And I think the first, and then there's another great guy, amazing guy, and probably maybe one of the best singers alive. Delbert's another guy that's like, every time he opens his mouth, the right stuff just comes out. It's just
amazing.
You look at guys and go like, damn, can you ever not? He just nails it. We're just right every time. Soulful. So I meet Delbert through Stephen Bruton. I'm new to Nashville, and Gary Nicholson, who's playing with Delbert, and he's kind of, those guys are thick as thieves. They're tight.
Yes.
And Gary, and they need a guitar player. And so I go over to Gary's house and sit down with Delbert, and we go over a set list of 30 songs. Can you do this gig next week, and maybe you can start playing in my band? I said, okay. He gives me a couple of cassettes, so I learn all this stuff, which are, most of it's like straight ahead stuff. It stops and starts and intros and what keys it in. And it's funny because I get on stage, no rehearsal. This is kind of the Nashville thing starts to kick in. And I've got my set list and my notes of these 30 tunes. And, the first song is something that he never even mentioned to me, and says, calls it out and says, you started. That's what Delbert's like. First of all, he kind of barks. He turns around and he goes, hello. And you usually go like, to the drummer, you go, what did he say?
Yeah.
And he said, old weakness.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And then he goes, well, you started.
Yeah.
And the first time we played it, I said, how's it go?
Yeah.
Just hum me the intro. Okay. So, that's kind of how that went. And when I started to play with Delbert, I figured out real quick. I think the first gig, I brought my Vox AC30 and my Telly, which I'd been playing. I was using that with Carlene Carter. I played with that for a little while, and that worked really well. Great combo. Delbert, it didn't kind of fit in. It was kind of working, but it wasn't fitting. And then I brought my VT40 and this Strat, and I found a whole new world. And that's kind of when I stopped playing around with all the garbage. Not that it's garbage, but first of all, there's a certain kind of music. It's not like I had to, cover some signature guitar lick from the intro of a record that has echoes and whatever.
All of a sudden, you could get just a good guitar sound, and you weren't having to replicate, some signature thing that some session guy did. Like you said, with
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And I sort of rediscovered the early years of playing guitar, of like just plugging into the amp, getting a sound, and using your volume control once in a while. And also, that's about when I stopped using picks.
Okay.
I was dragging a nylon string around on the road in a hotel room all the time just to keep myself occupied. Not any kind of classical guitar player, but just, when you noodle, I can never play the guitar by myself. You know what I mean? One of those guys is kind of like, what do I play?
Yeah.
But if you learn some classical, you can entertain yourself. So I would do a lot of that, and I started to get this right hand technique thing going. I mean, I've been working on it for many years, but it started to come together. And then I just said one day, why don't I play electric guitar this way? And with the Strat and that Ampeg amp, that VT40, I just kind of found this thing. That VT40 had a really wide front end and a certain kind of gain structure that you could plug a single coil guitar into it, as long as you turn the amp up, which you always have to do to get any amp to sound, find that spot.
Yeah.
And man, I just found that I could change sounds by changing the way I touch the strings and maybe use my volume control once in a while. And, that became my new basis for playing guitar again, because it just seemed like for years, when I got a guitar, I'd just go like this and that.
Yeah.
Marshall,
Yeah.
Tube Screamer, Echoplex for this song,
Right.
And then I just stopped doing that, and I realized that I played much better guitar, and you could actually feel it with an audience too. Like, because you can, there's, when you play, you either connect with an audience or you don't, and sometimes it's an incredibly special thing when you could just play guitar. And occasionally, if you're having a good night, like the audience might actually applaud because you played a solo, or you kind of can tell that, whoa, I think I got across there.
Yeah.
And anyhow, that's sort of probably about, for me, whenever that was, 97, 95, 96, stopped hauling 8 guitars and 6 amps and a switching system around.
So you had the 59 Strat and the Ampeg VT40. Did you
I
have
had
any?
a tuner.
A tuner?
I had a Demeter tremolo pedal,
Yeah.
and maybe an overdrive for occasionally.
Yeah.
And my overdrive at that point of choice was a Ibanez classic metal pedal with the distortion turned all the way down.
Okay.
I have no idea if it's a good pedal or
Yeah.
not, but it was working
But
for
it
me.
worked for that rig.
Yeah.
So you moved to Nashville and you played with Carlene Carter for a while, which also Al Anderson was in that band.
Yeah, and I
Which-
was in the band with Al.
Yeah. And of course, he's kind of got a following as a songwriter now, but more people know him as the great Telecaster player in NRBQ, and they played a lot of great stuff on there. And there's some great clips online of you and he playing together with Carlene. But so you played with Carlene, and then you started playing with Delbert McClinton. Now, how did the amp repair stuff come in? How did that happen?
It happened because I must have been insane for a little while.
Yeah.
No, I don't know how it happened. I think I thought, I'm pretty good at messing with that stuff, and I might want to do that on the side, especially after coming here and kind of going, okay, we're not going to fly around on private jets anymore, which is cool. I mean, I did get a little spoiled.
Yeah.
But, my wife and I have 3 kids. They were young. I kind of was more of the idea of, I don't really want to spend, 12 months on a road anymore. If I can do weekends, that would be cool.
Yeah.
But I probably can't make enough bread, So what else could I do? So I started messing around again with electronics. So when I was a young kid, I was into electronics. Before I even started to play guitar, I was into ham radio. Like most guys who are building amps now.
Yeah.
Most of us around our age, I should say my age, at one point were into ham radio. And so when I was 7 years old, I got my novice license and, learned Morse code, and I built a power supply and a transmitter, and used to sit up in my bedroom with headphones and a code key and try and, So I sort of had this fundamental electronics thing from when I was a little kid. And I didn't, and then I started to play music. And so now I'm getting to be 40 years old or so. I'm kind of just sort of reading magazines and fixing my amp. I'll tell you how it happened. I started playing AC-30s in around 1990 or something. And those damn things break down
All the time.
every time you turn them on. So I started fixing it. and you know what? Lo and behold, a couple of years later, I'm like fixing amps for other people because I'm kind of good at it.
Yeah.
And I play guitar. So that's kind of how it started. It's just a little thing I would do out of my garage if I wasn't out with Delbert or Richard Marx or some of the other people I played with.
Yeah.
And then it just kind of snowballed on me, to where it got like, my God, this is Nashville, and apparently there aren't too many other people around that do this, because all of a sudden everybody's running their gear down to my house.
Well, I can say that the difference is that you as a player, you would actually play through it and hear what it sounded like. You were not just seeing a problem and fixing it. You were looking at the whole amp and the health of it and how it sounded.
Yeah, well, obviously, because it's such an important thing, and there's a whole lot to talk about there too. It's kind of an interesting idiom, I guess you'd call it, when you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
So what we have this world. You've got 10 amplifiers sitting here, guitar amps. They're all basically the same technology, and they're all basically the same era of technology, which started in about the early 40s. I mean, really started in the 30s.
Mm-hmm.
But then sort of, there was a big breakthrough of circuitry and vacuum tube production, to where all of a sudden, like, people figured it out. Yeah, we can build a 30-watt amp,
Right.
And with the push-pull idea and circuit, and Williamson's negative feedback, global negative feedback, to tame these high-powered beasts. It's sort of started a revolution that probably really took hold in 43 or something like that, right? And so very little of anything in this world of amplifiers, when we're talking about Fenders or Voxes or Marshalls or whatever's, has really changed from then.
No, it hasn't.
It's kind of like most people are kind of trying to figure out, how the hell do I make a Tweed Deluxe? And that's what most boutique builders are doing. How do I make a Plexi Marshall like they used to? Mm-hmm. Or, those blackface Fenders, or those old Dan Electros, or, whatever. It's often like a recreation of what's already been done. And it's the same thing with guitars, right?
Right.
It's like, we go and to the NAMM show and marvel at all these new guitars, and I'll be damned if 90% of them aren't like, look, a Stratocaster with a twist,
Yeah.
A Telecaster body, a Les Paul body. I mean, it's kind of like 1951, they made that broadcaster, whatever it was. People are still trying to figure out how to make a 1951
and
guitar.
they're still doing reissues.
As good as they did in 1951.
Copies. Yes.
And how do we make the pickups like as good as they did way back then, 60 years ago?
Yeah.
And all of it, speakers, it's an interesting thing in guitar. So, for me as a player, and also, having an interest in electronics, I just kind of figured one day, hey man, I think I might go for this. And at first I was kind of like, well, I don't know if I should make that jump, because, you're either a musician and you're all in, or you're out, probably. And then I thought, I'm just going to get over that. I don't need to fit that, mold of what I think. Maybe that's all in my head. I don't know, because I dig amps and I think it's creative and artful. And so one of the reasons I'm building amps today is I think that there's other ways to approach the whole thing, rather than saying, I've got a Tweed Deluxe, but with higher headroom. You know what I mean? It's like if I hear one more or read one more review of a Tweed Deluxe, but with 6 L6s, I'm going to shoot the magazine or something. I don't know.
Right.
It's kind of like, I get it. Yeah, I know. It was a great amp, and there's like 15 or 25 builders doing it already. Mm-hmm. I don't think we need another one.
Right.
We don't need another, 18-watt Marshall knockoff.
Hi, this is Bob Weil. Stay tuned for part 3, where Todd Sharp shows us his amps.
I just want to make a great guitar.